The wind cut across the plains like a whip, carrying dust and the faint smell of sagebrush. Eliza clutched the small leather satchel to her chest, her knuckles white against the worn strap. Every step she took on the uneven wooden planks of the frontier train station made her heart pound louder. And yet she could not turn back. She had traveled thousands of miles from Minnesota, leaving behind her family, her home, everything she had ever known, for a promise inked on a letter, a promise of a man she had never met. The words of that letter had seemed so simple at the time. I need a wife. You will be safe here. You will be loved. But as the steam from the departing train clouded her vision, doubt gnawed at the edges of her courage. Across the dusty yard, leaning against the post of the station, was a figure larger than life. His boots were thick with dried mud, his hands rough as bark, and his frame seemed to block the horizon itself. He was a man who belonged to the land, every muscle and scar telling the story of years spent wrestling with the unforgiving plains. As their eyes met, Eliza felt a shiver, not entirely from the cold. The man she had been promised was real, more imposing than she had imagined, and yet there was something in his gaze, a flicker of something softer, almost hesitant, that hinted he was as uncertain about her as she was about him. You must be Eliza, he said, his voice deep like gravel sliding down a canyon. There was a pause, as if he were measuring her, gauging whether the tiny woman before him could possibly belong to the life he lived. I'm Callum, he added, his massive hand extended. She hesitated for a moment before taking it, the warmth of his grip both reassuring and terrifying. The breadth of his palm swallowed her own delicate hand, and she had to remind herself to breathe. As they rode from the station to his ranch, the landscape unfurled like a painting, endless golden fields that met jagged mountains at the horizon, the sun dipping low and painting the sky in bruised purples and fiery oranges. Eliza clutched the reins of the wagon, feeling every bump in the road, every jolt of the horse's hooves. Callum watched her out of the corner of his eye, noting the way she flinched at the first gust of wind, the way her fingers trembled around the straps of her bag. He wanted to reassure her, to tell her she had nothing to fear, but the words caught somewhere in his throat. The West was not gentle. It had no patience for the timid, and even love could not soften its harsh edges. They reached the ranch as night began to settle, casting long shadows across the wooden fences and barns. Eliza's eyes widened at the sight. A sprawling homestead with horses grazing nearby, a barn that smelled of hay and animals, and a house that seemed both welcoming and intimidating all at once. Callum swung down from the wagon and offered her his hand again. Welcome home, he said. She nodded, unsure whether the trembling in her body was from the cold, the fear, or the strange fluttering hope that maybe this life could belong to her. Inside, the warmth of the fireplace wrapped around her like a heavy blanket. The ranch smelled of wood smoke, leather, and the faintest trace of his cologne, something earthy and solid. Callum moved to stoke the fire, the silence stretching between them like a rope that neither dared pull too hard. Finally, he broke it. I won't lie, he said, leaning against the mantel. I've never been married. I don't know the first thing about how to make this easy. Eliza swallowed, feeling her chest tighten. I've never done this either, she whispered. And in that confession, a fragile bond began to form. They were two strangers, thrust together by letters and promises, and yet somehow in the quiet of that room, they felt less alone. The first week on the ranch tested every nerve she had. The mornings were cold and the work unrelenting. She learned quickly that Callum's world demanded more than courage. It demanded resilience, a willingness to face the raw, unpolished edges of life head on. She learned the smell of sweat and horses, the sharp tang of metal and the unforgiving sun on her back. And yet, as she labored, Callum watched, silently guiding her, offering brief instructions and in small gestures, a hand on her shoulder, a steadying arm when she wavered. He communicated more than words ever could, but not all moments were patient. One afternoon, while mending a fence, she misjudged a step and twisted her ankle. Pain shot up her leg and she fell to the ground, a gasp escaping her lips. Callum was there in an instant, lifting her gently, his face a mixture of worry and something she could not name. I told you to be careful, he muttered more softly than his tone suggested. I can't lose you before you've even settled in. The raw honesty in his voice made her cheeks burn, a confusing mix of fear and something that stirred in her chest, a dangerous spark she could not ignore. As days turned into weeks, Eliza realized that this life, though harsh, had a rhythm, a pulse she could come to know. The nights spent by the fire, listening to the wind howl across the plains, became moments of quiet intimacy. The mornings, though brutal, were tempered by laughter and shared effort. She began to see Callum not just as the massive cowboy who had scared her at first sight, but as a man shaped by hardship, a man who had survived when many others would have faltered, and somewhere between the toil and the firelight, she started to believe that love, messy, unrefined, and frightening, could exist here too. But the West had a way of testing even the strongest hearts, and Eliza could feel the storm approaching long before it arrived. Letters from distant relatives hinted at troubles back home. Whispers of outlaws in the county stirred the nerves of even the hardiest ranchers. And beneath Callum's calm, stoic exterior, there was a tension that she could sense. A weight of secrets unspoken and promises yet to be tested. The path ahead would demand courage, resilience, and perhaps a willingness to surrender to feelings neither of them fully understood. The next morning broke with a sky painted in pale apricot and violet, the sun rising slowly over the horizon as if reluctant to wake the world. Eliza woke before dawn, the chill of the unheated bedroom curling around her like a warning. She sat on the edge of the bed, her small hands clasped together, feeling the ache in her muscles from the previous day's labor. Every joint in her body screamed with fatigue, yet her mind refused to rest. She watched the shadows shift across the rough wooden floor, listening to the creaks of the ranch as it came alive. Somewhere outside, a rooster crowed, a sound she had come to associate with both promise and dread. Callum was already gone when she stepped outside. The morning air was sharp against her cheeks, carrying the scent of dew-soaked earth, horses, and the faint metallic tang of the nearby creek. She noticed the hoofprints in the mud where Callum's horse had been tethered, large and deep, a reminder of his overwhelming presence in her life. The ranch in the pale morning light seemed almost serene, but Eliza knew better. Beauty here was deceptive. A sudden shift in the wind could signal a storm, a lost animal, or an encounter with men whose intentions were less than honorable. She drew her shawl tighter around her shoulders and began her own morning tasks, gathering eggs from the coop, carrying buckets of water, and attempting to imitate the steady, practiced movements of Callum she had observed. When he returned, covered in dust and sweat, his presence filled the small yard like a tide rolling in. He dismounted without a word, tying his horse with hands that seemed too large for such delicate knots. He caught her watching him, and for a moment there was a flicker of something almost tender in his eyes. "You shouldn't push yourself so hard," he said, his voice lower than usual, almost private, almost a confession. Eliza shook her head, unsure whether she was defying him, proving herself, or trying to convince herself that she belonged here. She realized she didn't yet know the difference. The days blurred together in a rhythm that was exhausting and yet strangely hypnotic. Mornings were work, tending to the fields, mending fences, checking the livestock. Afternoons were preparation, cooking, cleaning, organizing stores for the harsh months to come. Evenings were reserved for conversation, meals, and the rare moments when they could sit together by the fire without the constant intrusion of the demands of survival. Eliza learned quickly that the West did not coddle weakness. It demanded persistence, grit, and the courage to face discomfort without complaint. Callum never shouted, never berated. Instead, he observed silently, offering guidance in brief instructions or small gestures. A hand on her back, a rope passed with steady precision, a quiet warning whispered when she reached too far or misjudged a step. One evening, as the sun bled behind the mountains and painted the sky in bruised reds and golds, a rider approached from the distance. The horse's hooves drummed a tense rhythm across the plains, and Callum's body stiffened, the relaxed veneer of the ranch slipping away. The rider was young, haggard, wearing clothes that spoke of desperate travel and hard nights without shelter. He dismounted with a jerky motion, revealing a face etched with fear and determination. "Mr. Callum," the man said, voice trembling. "There's trouble down by the river. Outlaws, they took the McCarthy wagon." Callum's expression hardened, the warmth that had softened around Eliza disappearing in an instant. "Stay inside," he commanded, eyes never leaving the approaching man. He moved with practiced speed, grabbing his rifle, checking the revolver at his hip, and mounting his horse with a precision that made Eliza catch her breath. She wanted to call out, to warn him to be careful, but the words lodged in her throat. Instead, she watched, heart hammering, as the man she had barely begun to know transformed before her eyes. From the hesitant, almost gentle husband-to-be into a man who had survived a dozen fights, a dozen storms, and countless betrayals. Hours passed, and Eliza remained by the window, wringing her hands. listening to the distant echoes of gunfire that carried across the plains like the voice of the land itself. Wild, untamed, and merciless. Her imagination spun scenes of danger, violence, and heroism, each one more terrifying than the last. When Callum finally returned, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. A faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "They won't be troubling us again anytime soon," he said, though his eyes carried the weight of the confrontation. She could see the strain in his muscles, the tension that would take hours, maybe days, to leave his body. And yet beneath it all, there was a protective fire burning, the same fire she had glimpsed in his eyes from the very first day. That night they sat together by the fireplace. The warmth of the fire seemed to extend beyond the room, wrapping around them both in fragile security. Eliza finally spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I was so scared today," she admitted. I thought something would happen to you." Callum reached for her hand, the contrast between his rough, scarred palm and her delicate fingers striking and oddly comforting. "I can't promise the world will be safe," he said, voice low and rough. "But I can promise I won't let anyone take you from it." In the silence that followed, Eliza felt a strange suffocating emotion, fear, longing, and a tenderness that both thrilled and terrified her. Days turned into weeks, and Eliza discovered small truths about Callum that revealed the man beneath the exterior of muscle and authority. He laughed quietly when she made mistakes in the kitchen, cursed under his breath when an animal misbehaved, and hummed low, almost imperceptibly, while tending the fields. She discovered that he could be gentle, fiercely protective, stubborn beyond measure, and yet capable of moments so tender they nearly made her weep. And as she began to learn his rhythms, his moods, and his unspoken rules, she realized she was falling. Not just into life on the ranch, not just into the dangers and the work, but into a connection so deep and immediate that it frightened her. But the West was never patient with hearts untested. One morning, a harsh wind swept across the plains, carrying with it rumors, threats, and the smell of blood. A rider arrived, this one more deliberate, more menacing than the last. He brought news that would shake the fragile peace they had built, a secret from Callum's past that threatened not only the ranch, but the fragile trust between them. Eliza felt it before she saw the fear flicker in Callum's eyes. The world beyond the ranch was relentless, filled with people who would stop at nothing, and the life she had begun to imagine here was now tangled with danger, desire, and secrets yet to be revealed. The morning broke with a brittle chill that cut through the thin layers Eliza had wrapped around herself. Frost coated the edges of the wooden fence posts and the tall grasses of the plains, each blade sparkling like fractured glass in the pale light. The wind carried a sharpness that made her shiver, not just from the cold but from a sense of unease that had settled in her chest over the past days. She moved cautiously across the yard, the snow-crusted ground crunching beneath her boots, her eyes scanning the horizon for any movement. The plains, beautiful and infinite, seemed suddenly vast and unwelcoming, a reminder that the West demanded vigilance even from those who had begun to feel at home. Callum had not returned from his early ride, leaving her with a silence so profound it pressed against her eardrums. She tried to busy herself with the morning chores, stacking firewood, checking the livestock, but her hands trembled and her mind raced with imagined scenarios. Each shadow beyond the barn seemed to hint at danger. Every gust of wind carried the whisper of threats both real and imagined. She felt utterly exposed, acutely aware of her smallness in a world dominated by brute strength, danger, and men like Callum, men who bore their burdens silently but carried scars she could only guess at. It was mid-morning when he returned, dust and frost clinging to his coat, his expression tight and wary. In his hand he held a folded piece of paper, edges frayed from handling. "We have company," he said quietly, voice low enough that she almost missed the gravity behind it. He set the paper on the rough wooden table, and Eliza's eyes followed its path, noting the urgency in the scrawled handwriting. The letter spoke of a man from Callum's past, a rival with a reputation as cold and dangerous as the winter winds themselves, someone who would stop at nothing to settle old debts. Eliza felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had begun to imagine a life here, evenings by the fire, mornings spent learning the rhythms of the ranch, laughter that came easily now that her hands had learned the tasks of the land. And yet, already, the fragile illusion of safety was slipping. Callum did not speak much of his past, only fragments, fleeting mentions of betrayal, loss, and blood spilled over pride, But Eliza had seen it in the way he tensed at unexpected sounds, how his eyes flicked toward the horizon at every distant hoofbeat. Now with the letter before them, the shadows of his history had stepped into the present, threatening to unravel the delicate bond that had begun to form. She tried to meet his gaze, searching for reassurance, and found instead a storm barely restrained. A man poised between duty, vengeance, and the instinct to protect the woman who had dared to step into his world. Over the next days, the tension became almost unbearable. Callum's movements were precise, economical, each action deliberate as he prepared for the inevitable confrontation. Eliza followed him quietly, absorbing his methods, learning the subtleties of life on the ranch in a way she hadn't before. She became adept at tending the livestock, predicting the moods of the animals, even anticipating the changes in the weather. Yet for all her adaptation, she could not ignore the ache in her chest whenever he rode away, leaving her in a silence thick with dread. Each departure was a small torment, each return a relief that was never quite complete, because the shadow of danger loomed, unrelenting over every hour. One evening, as the sun bled into the mountains and painted the sky in deep purples and oranges, Callum finally spoke of what had haunted him for years. He leaned against the barn, his frame outlined by the fading light, and for the first time his voice broke with vulnerability. "There's a man," he said, "from a time before you. A man who believes I owe him something he's willing to kill for." Eliza, frozen in the doorway, felt the words strike her like a physical blow. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she whispered. Callum turned toward her, his massive hands cupping her face with surprising gentleness. "Because I couldn't. I needed to know I could keep you safe first. Now, I don't know." The admission left a silence that was almost sacred, a shared acknowledgement of danger, trust, and the fragile intimacy that had formed in the shadow of violence. The first real threat arrived days later. Eliza was fetching water from the creek when she saw movement at the edge of the woods. A figure cloaked in shadow, watching, waiting. Fear rooted her to the spot. The man stepped closer and instinct took over. She turned and ran, stumbling over roots and rocks, heart hammering in her chest. She barely noticed the cold as it bit through her shawl, barely noticed the ache in her muscles until Callum's voice rang out across the clearing. "Eliza!" he shouted, and she felt the earth shift beneath her panic. He appeared beside her in an instant, his hand gripping hers, pulling her behind him as he assessed the threat. The man lurking at the edge of the trees froze, weighing his options, and then, with a curse, disappeared into the woods, leaving only the sound of distant leaves rustling. Later, by the warmth of the fire, Eliza's hands shook as she recounted the encounter. Callum's expression was unreadable, jaw tight, eyes dark. "The West doesn't forgive mistakes," he murmured, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "And it doesn't forget them either." She shivered, not just from fear, but from the proximity of him, the heat radiating from his body, the undeniable pull of desire mixed with terror. She realized in that charged silence that the West demanded not only courage but surrender. Surrender to the land, to survival, to love that was as frightening as it was inevitable. As the nights grew colder and the threats more persistent, Eliza discovered a strength within herself she had never known. She learned to anticipate danger, to react with a swiftness that surprised even Callum. She felt the rhythm of the ranch in her bones, the pulse of the plains in her chest, and the gravity of Callum's presence in her soul. Yet every victory, every small triumph over fear, was tempered by the knowledge that the world beyond the ranch was ruthless, that Callum's past was not easily outrun, and that love, though blossoming in the firelight, would be tested in ways she had never imagined. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when the wind whispered secrets through the broken fences and the stars stretched cold and infinite across the sky, Eliza understood that she had chosen a life of danger, love, and intensity, a life that demanded courage she had yet to fully claim, and a heart that would be tested by storms both external and internal. The days that followed were heavy with a sense of impending reckoning. The wind carried a bite sharper than usual, slicing across the plains and rattling the wooden shutters of the ranch. Eliza rose each morning before the sun, her body aching from labor yet driven by a restless fear that clung to her like a shadow. The land seemed to sense the tension, the way the trees shivered, the way the horses grew skittish in the stable, the way the creek's water churned against its banks as if warning them of some unseen force approaching. She moved through her tasks with careful deliberation, every step measured, every glance alert. The ranch had become a theater of vigilance, and she was learning painfully and quickly that survival demanded not only courage but constant awareness. Callum, meanwhile, was a man transformed by necessity. The imposing presence she had first seen at the station had grown even more formidable in the face of threat. His jaw was set, his hands steady as ever, but his eyes, those stormy gray eyes, carried a burden heavier than she had yet witnessed. He moved through the ranch with an intensity that bordered on obsession, checking every lock, inspecting the fences, keeping watch over the horizon as though danger could rise from the very soil. Yet even amid this vigilance, there were moments when he softened, catching her glance and allowing a fleeting smile, a gesture that reminded her that beneath the armor of duty and threat, there was a man capable of tenderness, of desire, of longing. One morning, the fragile peace shattered. A rider appeared over the crest of the hills, the sound of hooves kicking up dirt loud against the stillness of the dawn. Eliza's heart raced. She knew instinctively that it was no friendly traveler. Callum emerged from the barn, rifle in hand, his expression hard and unreadable. The rider slowed as he approached, a hat pulled low over his face, the air between them charged with suspicion and threat. Words were exchanged, terse and clipped, the kind that carried more meaning in their silence than in their sound. Eliza watched, frozen, as Callum's posture shifted, muscles coiled, ready to strike yet controlled, precise, every movement a testament to the countless battles he had survived. After the rider left, leaving only dust in his wake, Callum turned to her. His voice was quieter now, stripped of bravado, revealing the raw edge of fear that he usually masked. "They're coming," he said, and she saw it in his eyes. Not just the threat to the ranch, but the danger to them both, to the fragile bond they had built. Eliza's stomach twisted. She had imagined love on the ranch as something serene, perhaps even predictable. But the West had other plans. It demanded sacrifice, it demanded courage, and it demanded the kind of trust that was forged only in the fire of shared danger. The next days were a blur of preparation and unease. Callum taught Eliza how to handle the rifle, how to anticipate threats, how to read the signs of the land for danger. Her hands, once delicate and trembling, became calloused and precise, mirroring his in ways that surprised them both. She learned to ride faster, to move silently, to speak with the economy of necessity. Yet for all this skill, she could not quell the fear that clung to her chest. A constant reminder that the West did not forgive mistakes. Every shadow was a potential threat, every gust of wind a whisper of warning. And then there were the moments between the danger, moments that made the fear almost unbearable for entirely different reasons. The nights by the fire, when Callum's eyes lingered on her a fraction too long, when his hands brushed hers under the pretense of adjusting blankets or handing her tools, when his voice softened as he spoke of survival, of home, of what it meant to protect someone. She felt her pulse quicken in ways that had nothing to do with fear. Desire and longing coiled tight in her chest, twisting her resolve into something tender and frightening all at once. She caught herself staring at him, memorizing the way his lips pressed together when concentrating, the way his fingers flexed when handling ropes, the rough planes of his face softened by the firelight. One evening, the storm arrived, both literal and figurative. A blizzard swept across the plains, howling through the gaps in the walls, rattling the shutters and whipping the ranch into chaos. At the same time, a messenger arrived with news that made Eliza's heart sink. The man from Callum's past had not waited, and the threat he posed was closer, more dangerous, and more determined than ever. Callum moved with an urgency that bordered on desperation, securing the ranch, fortifying doors and windows, and ensuring that Eliza was never far from his side. Yet as he worked, she saw cracks in his control, the tension in his shoulders, the haunted look in his eyes, the way he clenched his jaw when alone for even a moment. She realized then that the West did not just test muscles and courage. It tested hearts, resilience, and the very limits of trust. That night, huddled together by the fireplace while the wind howled outside, Callum spoke to her with a vulnerability that stunned her. "Eliza," he whispered, "I can't promise the world won't try to take you from me. I can't promise I'll always be able to stop it. But I can promise you this, I won't let anyone, anything, take you from this place we're building together." She leaned against him, feeling the warmth of his body, the steady beat of his heart, and the weight of his promise pressing against her own fears. She realized in that moment that love, like survival, was not gentle. It demanded courage, sacrifice, and an unwavering willingness to face storms both outside and within. Over the following weeks, Eliza and Callum became an unspoken team, their connection deepening amid adversity. They learned to anticipate each other's needs, to read the subtle cues that marked danger, and to find fleeting moments of tenderness in the cracks of harsh reality. Yet the shadow of the past lingered, a constant reminder that the West was never forgiving, and that every heartbeat of desire carried with it the weight of potential loss. And in those quiet hours before the dawn, when the storm had passed and the plains lay hushed beneath a blanket of snow, Eliza understood the truth that had been growing inside her. Love, survival, and courage were inseparable here. The West demanded everything, and she had begun to realize that she was willing to give it all, for the man who had claimed her heart, for the life they had started to build, and for the fragile hope that together they could weather any storm. The days that followed the storm were heavy with silence, each one stretching longer than the last, filled with a tense anticipation that seemed to settle over the ranch like a suffocating fog. The plains, which had moments ago seemed harsh but fair, now felt menacing, each shadow elongated, each whisper of wind a subtle warning. Eliza moved through her chores with a quiet determination, the routine now infused with a new intensity. The firewood had to be stacked higher, the fences checked twice over, the animals fed with precision. Every action was a rehearsal, a preparation for threats she could feel but not yet see. The world beyond the ranch was closing in, and she felt the weight of it pressing down on her small shoulders. Callum was a man transformed by worry. His massive frame, already imposing, now seemed charged with a latent fury that made the air around him taut. He no longer laughed, no longer allowed himself the moments of rare tenderness when the West was calm. Instead, he moved with the precision of a man anticipating battle, eyes scanning the horizon constantly, hands never far from his rifle, every breath a preparation for confrontation. And yet, in the rare moments when he glanced at Eliza, there was a softness, a flicker of care and desire that neither of them could fully articulate. She saw it in the way his eyes lingered, in the brief brush of his fingers against hers, in the quiet murmurs of reassurance spoken in moments when the world beyond the ranch paused for just a heartbeat. It was mid-afternoon when the first attack came. A band of men, rough and armed, descended upon the edge of the property with horses kicking up clouds of dust. Eliza's heart hammered in her chest as Callum shouted commands, his voice carrying across the plains sharp and decisive. She ran to his side, instinctively knowing where to be, what to do, even as fear threatened to immobilize her. The horses reared, the men shouted, and the air was thick with tension so dense it made it hard to breathe. Callum's rifle barked, each shot precise, his movements a dance of practiced violence. Eliza watched him awestruck and terrified. The man she had begun to love revealed in all his power, his danger and his unflinching courage amid the chaos. Eliza found herself acting on instinct rather than thought. She guided the horses to safer ground, secured the animals in the barn, and assisted Callum when a man breached the fence line. Every nerve in her body was alive, every heartbeat a drum in her chest. She realized in that moment that the West did not allow for hesitation. Courage was immediate, raw, and unyielding. She glanced at Callum, who was engaged in a tense standoff, and felt a strange, electrifying mix of fear and desire. Fear for his safety, desire for the connection that had been growing between them, and admiration for his strength and decisiveness. The attack ended as suddenly as it began, the men retreating, leaving dust and the smell of gunpowder in their wake. Callum, breathing heavily, returned to Eliza, his hands rough against her arms, his eyes dark with relief, fear, and an emotion she could not name. "Are you hurt?" he asked, voice roughened by adrenaline. She shook her head, unable to speak, and he held her closer, the warmth of his body and the steadying presence of his hands anchoring her racing heart. In that embrace, Eliza felt the full weight of their connection, the bond forged not in comfort, but in the crucible of danger, shared fear, and the desperate need to protect one another. The days that followed were marked by a fragile, almost sacred intimacy. The ranch needed repair, fences rebuilt, and defenses strengthened, yet in the quiet moments, when the world outside held its breath, Eliza and Callum allowed themselves to feel, to acknowledge the deepening pull between them. He would brush her hair from her face, linger over her hands as he helped with chores, or speak her name in a low, tender voice that made her pulse catch. And Eliza, in turn, found herself daring to look into his eyes longer, to linger closer, to allow the warmth of his presence to seep into her very bones. Love, dangerous and overwhelming, had crept into the space between survival and duty, leaving them both breathless and exposed. Yet even as passion and connection deepened, the threat of the past lingered. Rumors of bounty hunters and vengeful rivals reached the edges of the county, and the memory of that first rider who had arrived with news of Callum's old enemy remained fresh. Eliza understood with a clarity that both terrified and strengthened her that love in the West was never gentle. It demanded courage, sacrifice, and the willingness to face not just external threats, but the darkness lurking within hearts and the secrets, regrets, and unspoken fears that could destroy trust as surely as any gun or storm. One evening, as snow began to fall lightly over the plains, Eliza and Callum sat together by the fire. The wind rattled the shutters and the smell of smoke and wood filled the small room. He took her hand in both of his, rough and warm, and for the first time allowed himself to speak without pretense or caution. "Eliza," he murmured, "I've fought many battles, faced many men, and survived storms that would have killed most. But nothing has ever scared me like losing you. I can fight for the land, the ranch, even my life, but I can't fight what I feel for you, and I don't want to." Her breath caught, tears pricking her eyes, and she leaned into him, the firelight painting their faces with gold and shadow. In that moment, the world beyond the ranch, with all its dangers and threats, seemed both distant and irrelevant, eclipsed by the fierce, undeniable bond that had taken root between them. But the West is never patient, never forgiving. Just as desire and trust deepened, the shadow of Callum's past crept closer, threatening to unravel all they had built. The enemy he had long evaded was moving with purpose, closing the distance to the ranch, forcing Callum and Eliza to prepare for a confrontation that would demand everything they had: courage, cunning, and an unbreakable faith in one another. Eliza realized that survival and love were now inextricably linked. The future they had begun to imagine together could be snatched away in an instant, and the storm approaching was unlike any they had faced before. The first light of dawn struggled through a sky bruised with the remnants of a storm. The plains lay quiet, deceptively serene, the snow from the night before smothering the earth in silence, masking the tension that simmered beneath. Eliza woke early, her body stiff from the cold, her mind racing with thoughts she had tried to push aside for weeks. The enemy, Callum's relentless past, had drawn closer with every passing day, and she felt its presence like a shadow stretching across the ranch. She rose and wrapped herself in her shawl, breathing in the sharp morning air, steeling herself for what she knew was coming. Today would not be ordinary. Today would demand everything from her: courage, resolve, and a trust in Callum that went beyond fear and logic. Callum emerged from the barn moments later, his expression carved from determination and worry. He moved with a quiet, lethal precision, each motion deliberate, each glance toward the horizon wary. Eliza watched him, memorizing the set of his jaw, the hard lines of his face, the way his fingers brushed against his rifle as if it were an extension of himself. She knew the man she had fallen for was formidable, and yet, even in his immense strength, she sensed vulnerability, the weight of responsibility, the fear of losing everything he had fought to protect. As he approached, he caught her gaze, and in that instant no words were needed. The bond they had forged, and in firelight, in storms, in fleeting moments of tenderness, spoke louder than any warning or command. The hours that followed were a tense ballet of preparation. Fences were reinforced, the animals secured, and every window and door checked twice over. Eliza moved beside Callum, instinct guiding her as she learned to anticipate not just danger but his needs, the subtle cues that would allow them to act as one. She carried water, tightened ropes, and loaded rifles with steady hands that had grown used to the rhythm of survival. Yet beneath the precision, her heart thudded with the knowledge that this confrontation could change everything. The enemy was clever, ruthless, and intimately aware of Callum's past, and Eliza understood that the coming encounter would demand both courage and cunning beyond anything she had experienced. The first signs of intrusion came in the form of movement at the tree line, shadows shifting against the snow, the faintest sound of hooves on frozen earth. Callum stiffened, signaling her to stay close, his massive frame a shield between her and the threat. They watched in tense silence as a figure emerged, moving with deliberate caution, eyes scanning the ranch like a predator assessing its prey. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. The enemy had arrived, and the storm of confrontation could no longer be avoided. When the man drew close enough, the air erupted with violence. Rifles cracked, boots skidded on frozen ground, and shouts echoed across the plains, bouncing off hills and fences. Callum moved like a force of nature, commanding and precise, each motion a mixture of power and instinct honed over years of survival. Eliza beside him felt fear and exhilaration intertwine. She acted on reflex, moving animals to safety, assisting Callum when danger threatened to breach their defenses. Every heartbeat felt amplified, every shadow a potential threat, every glance at Callum a reminder of the fragile bond that had anchored her in this violent, unpredictable world. Amid the chaos, a moment arose that froze time. Callum, facing the enemy head-on, faltered briefly, and Eliza's instincts kicked in. She moved between him and the threat, her small hands clutching the rifle he had taught her to wield, her eyes burning with determination. For the first time, she felt the true weight of partnership, the power of trust, and the fierceness of love forged in adversity. She fired, a sharp crack splitting the air, and watched the enemy retreat, realizing in that moment that she was no longer the trembling mail-order bride who had arrived at the ranch. She was a survivor, a partner, a force intertwined with Callum's own strength and purpose. When the dust settled, Callum pulled her close, his arms enveloping her, and she felt the full intensity of the emotions that had grown between them. Relief, love, desire, and unspoken promises flowed in the space between their bodies, as palpable as the snow melting beneath their boots. "You were incredible," he murmured, voice roughened by adrenaline and awe. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Eliza pressed herself against him, feeling the warmth and solidity of his frame, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of a future here. Together, strong, unbroken, and fiercely alive. The following days were quieter, filled with the rhythm of rebuilding and reflection. Fences were repaired, the land restored to a semblance of peace, and the animals tended with care. Eliza and Callum found moments of tenderness between the labor, lingering by the fire, sharing meals, and allowing themselves the intimacy that had been tempered by fear and danger. She learned to read the subtle emotions in his eyes, to anticipate his needs, and to give and receive affection in ways that made the bond between them unbreakable. Each touch, each glance, each whispered word deepened the connection forged in adversity. And yet, even in peace, the West reminded them of its lessons. It was unforgiving, unpredictable, and relentless, demanding courage, sacrifice, and the strength to love fully, even in the face of uncertainty. Eliza understood more profoundly than ever that her journey, from trembling bride to steadfast partner, had been shaped by every storm, every shadow, every moment of fear and desire. And she knew, with a fierce, unshakable certainty, that whatever lay ahead, she and Callum would face it together,